Great. Thank you so much. It's really fun to be here. So as the introduction mentioned, I come from the University of Minnesota up at the Twin Cities campus where I'm based at the Institute on the Environment, which is on the St. Paul campus. We're in the old livestock pavilion right by the state fairgrounds. You can come and say hi to us if you're ever in that area. So I'm going to talk today about this idea of how we integrate economics and ecology to understand the value of nature and how that understanding and some of the frontiers of work we're doing at the university are helping us to make better decisions about conservation in Minnesota. So before I start with the content of that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of what is nature. And so if you would take a minute and just think yourself in your mind, like when you close your eyes and you think about the word nature, everyone, I'd like you to reflect on what sort of scene first comes to your mind. So what do you think about when you hear the word nature? What does nature bring to your mind's eye? Does anyone want to share what they think about when they think of nature? Yeah. Trees and flowers and plants. Lovely. Birds. Great. Wild areas. Yeah, absolutely. So maybe like a scene like this. This is sort of what I think about. Without the birds, I know I miss the birds. But usually we think about nature as plants and animals and birds and these sort of wild scenes. But what I want us to do in this, one of my goals for this talk is to start thinking about our role in nature. And thinking about nature as not this separate thing that we go and visit to, but actually part of our the systems that surround us and are part of our relationship with nature. And that's really where this interface of ecology and economics comes into play. So putting people into nature, and that's another way to understand nature's value. So the other part of this is thinking about nature not just as those separate areas, the boundary waters and the state park systems that we enjoy, but also nature that sustains us in the places we work and live. So the nature that's in the food we eat and the nature that's in the water that we drink and all those underlying natural systems that sustain human societies in our everyday. So when you think about the cities, there's a hydrologic system, there's plants, there's food production, there's waste, and all of those are occurring. The value of nature is really present if you start to think about all those different ways in which we're connected to those systems. So that's one goal of sort of rethinking the way we think about nature through this lens of how it impacts our own well-being. So I'm going to talk about the intersection of ecology and economics in this talk and what it reveals about the value of nature and its impact on conservation in Minnesota. And I think if you were to think about those two disciplines from an academic perspective, each of them is sort of pursuing their own interesting research questions in their own sort of academic silos. But what people really want, what users are demanding, sort of decision makers that work in this area are really interested in that intersection. So thinking about ecology and economics is sort of like thinking about the people and nature relationship, and the users or the decision makers often fall at that intersection in between. And that's really the focus of the work that I do, is understanding the intersection of people and nature, the intersection of ecology and economics. So I'm going to talk about three things tonight. First, I'll share a little bit about some of these users. So who are the people that are demanding this kind of information? Who's interested in that human-nature relationship? And a little background about this group called the Natural Capital Project. I'm going to talk about the conservation movement in general and in Minnesota and how that's changed over time, putting the current state that we're in a little bit in the context of environmental history. Because there's some really big shakeups happening right now in the conservation movement that maybe some of you are aware of, but there's some big controversies brewing, and there's some interesting stuff to talk about at that intersection. And then finally, I'm going to share a few stories about our work in Minnesota and how we're taking some of these concepts and bringing them into action, into decisions about our own lands and water. Okay, so first, who are these people that are interested in that human-nature relationship? So these are some of the partners that we work with at the Natural Capital Project. NatCap, as we call it, is a partnership that's been around for about a decade. And it's between the University of Minnesota and Stanford University in California, and two of the world's largest conservation organizations, the Nature Conservancy and the World Wildlife Fund. And it was started originally to get the really exciting science that's happening at these academic institutions into the hands of practitioners that are really on the ground, making implementation, doing the stuff that needs to get done to conserve our lands and waters. And it's since evolved to a really fruitful partnership across lots of different dimensions. But the partnership exists to serve these users that are outside of the academy, but they're groups that are trying to make decisions about how we manage our natural resources. And that varies from agencies like we think of our DNR or MPCA or Fish and Wildlife Service, to private sector companies that are trying to green their supply chain and think about their dependencies upon nature, and global conservation organizations working on all sorts of things from forest restoration to biodiversity protection. And then we also work with multilateral development banks like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank on making more sustainable lending decisions. So really variety of different users that are interested in this intersection. I think I'm getting too far away from my clicker. There we go. So what do these organizations want? What do we all want? Well, we want to have secure fresh water. We want sustainable, livable cities. We want resilient agricultural landscapes. So these are sort of the outcomes that these groups and many of us want to see happen in the world, the change that we want to make. But those outcomes they face a lot of barriers, and our group exists to address a really pervasive set of barriers. And that's around the fact that we have a system that's pretty biased in terms of what influences those outcomes. So we think primarily about the cost that we can see in markets, like the value of housing, for example, or the value of timber, or the value of the minerals that we can extract from the land, or the value of corn. Those are things that we have markets, they reflect their value, and those commodities, those market values often drive a lot of the decisions that we make about how we manage the environment. And they drive those decisions because we sort of know what their value is, and we have a whole system designed to reward and incentivize the production of those kinds of values. But as we all know, there's this whole other set of values that are also really important for human well-being, for healthy communities. And that's things like the value of having an aesthetically pleasing landscape, the value of being able to see wildlife, the value of having safe recreational opportunities for our kids and families, the value of having clean air and clean water. And those are not values that you can buy at a store. They're not values that have markets that capture their value and incentivize their production. So we have to look elsewhere. We have to look beyond markets to try and understand the value of these different things and how we can elevate them in decisions so we can get those outcomes that we want. So what I'm talking about is this concept of ecosystem services, or the value that nature provides to human well-being. And this could be a whole bunch of different things. So lots of ways in which nature sustains and protects and enhances our lives and livelihoods, some of which is captured in markets, but much of which is not. So just a quick example of what this looks like. This is the town of Elba, not far from here. So if you ask this question of what is this forest worth that's outside of this town, and you just thought about the value of the timber in the trees there, you would get one number, right? You could cut all those trees down, you could sell them in a market, and you'd know one definition of what that forest is worth. But there's lots of other services or benefits that that forest provide. That forest is protecting that community from flooding. If it wasn't there, there'd probably be disastrous floods. It's providing shade for recreational angling. My husband likes to fish in this area. It's providing habitat for game and non-game wildlife. Protecting the drinking water supply of that town. So they might have to invest in more expensive treatment if they didn't have that forest that was helping to recharge the groundwater and purify the water. It's improving property values, and we actually know there's pretty robust evidence that access and having clean water and having aesthetically pleasing landscapes increases people's property values, so that's a benefit. And it's providing habitat for pollinators and beneficial insects. And we could probably go on and think about other benefits. But the point here is that when you look at these systems and you take a very market-based or sort of a narrow definition of value, you might get a number that's pretty misleading relative to the true value of managing that system sustainably. And the goal of our work is really to elevate those other sets of values into decisions so they're also incorporated when we're trying to decide how we manage lands and waters. And these values, they change decisions. They actually really can make a big difference. So in Minnesota, we did some work about a year and a half ago with the Environmental Quality Board, where we updated what's called the social cost of carbon. And that's thinking about all the values associated with every ton of carbon that's emitted to the atmosphere from power production. And so it's not just the cost to climate change, but it's also air pollution impacts and health impacts. And once you start to add all those up, you get a different cost associated with all those externalities, all those potential consequences of carbon. And when you start to compare then energy that's derived from carbon-intensive fossil fuels versus maybe renewables, and you start to incorporate that value of carbon into that calculation, you can end up tipping the scale between what's the most efficient use of, what's the best way to get our energy. Is it through renewables or fossil fuels? So we're now using some of these updated numbers in decision making, and that's changing the portfolio of energy that we see on our landscapes. So having these numbers can change decisions. So what kinds of decisions? The groups that we work with are interested in a lot of these different dimensions. So we work a lot on cost-benefit assessments, thinking about spatial planning or targeting. So where should you get the biggest bang for your buck? All of us are dealing with situations where we have limited resources. We can't do conservation everywhere. We have to choose where we're going to make those investments, and these data can help us with that. Thinking about evaluating policies or payments or regulations, and then just a strategic use. So people are interested in being able to provide better messaging and communicate better to the public the payback of some of these investments. So in addition to that, a lot of our work focuses not just on the impacts of people on the environment, but also the way that the environment impacts our own human well-being. So thinking about both directions of that relationship. So a lot of these boil down to questions, in Minnesota at least, about where to protect or where to restore and what are the consequences. So that's where we really see our work feeding into decision makings across lots of different scales. Okay, so I mentioned the Natural Capital Project, and this is really the focus of a lot of our work, and we've worked heavily in Minnesota but around the world. Our team at the Institute on the Environment, you can get a little snapshot of us here. We're about a dozen people. Economists, ecologists, GIS technicians, software engineers. So we're a pretty diverse and interdisciplinary team. And then we work closely with people throughout the university and beyond to when we have particular projects where we need specialized expertise. One of our flagship products is a set of open source software tools called Invest. So if you're interested, you can go to our website, you can download Invest. And they're designed to run anywhere in the world with kind of readily available data to give people a picture of the consequences of decisions on the suite of different ecosystem services. So that question of what is a forest worth, we want to equip people to be able to answer that question all around the world. So nobody, if they want that information, there's a tool here to help you understand the potential consequences of decisions on that full suite of values. We work, as I mentioned, in lots of different locations all around the world, sort of expanding, making sure that this information is available to people who want to use it. So that's a quick overview of the project and sort of what motivates it and some of our key users and what they're interested in. And now I'm going to step back and talk a little bit about the conservation movement in general and how I see it relating to some of the things that we've discussed so far. And I mentioned at the beginning that I see the conservation movement as really at a crossroads. So there's some decisions, there's a lot of soul searching going around in the big conservation organizations about what is our place in the world today in terms of what's the motivation for conservation and how do we best proceed with a strategy going forward. So if you think way back to our first conceptions of how we thought about our relationship to nature and our relationship to wilderness, it wasn't always this sort of touchy-feely good thing, right? Nature was seen as a dark and dismal place where all manner of wild beasts dash about uncooked. That's a very different perception of nature. And of course, that evolved over time. And what we started to see as we had a greater human footprint on the landscape as people started to view nature through a different lens and saw it as this place of respite, this place of peace. And the early conservation movement really emerged in the late 1800s as an attempt to start to preserve and protect what was now increasingly being seen as really important assets for the public. And the Nature Conservancy was really born under that idea of saving the last great places. So the role of conservation organizations was to protect and preserve those great places, to protect and preserve nature. But of course, that got increasingly complicated as well. So this is the spotted owl. In the 90s, there was really big tension between nature and jobs, right? So how do you balance species conservation with economic development? And that really put that human-nature relationship as one of conflict. Again, and that was a really tough moment, I think, in the conservation community in trying to figure out how to balance those really important economic and human aspects with the desire to set up these reserves and protect and preserve biodiversity. If you overlay that tension with all of these global drivers that we're currently experiencing, if we think about climate change and increased demand for land and population growth, and we have all sorts of increased pressures on natural systems, it's hard to even imagine a last great place that's protected from all of that, all of those different impacts. At the same time, there's also this increasing urgency in the conservation movement to do as much as we can to protect and preserve nature and biodiversity as long as we can, as while there's still enough left. So, fast forwarding to today, this is the cover page of the World Wildlife Fund and their updated tagline. So WWF used to be primarily about species conservation, the panda is their logo. But they've revised their strategy, and now they talk about a future for people and nature. So that, you can see it let's see, I'll go ahead to TNC. The same thing, their new mission, it's no longer saving the last great places, it's conserving the lands and waters on which all life depends. So underlying these new mission statements is really a greater recognition that the people and nature dynamic has to be front and center in conservation. And so that conservation can no longer be nature for nature's sake, that it has to be for nature and people. And so bringing people's needs, people's wants, people's preferences, people's values into the conservation communities is one of the things that I think that community is particularly wrestling with right now. And this has created all sorts of interesting dynamics and a lot of tension in the community about if this is the appropriate way to go forward, if embracing people is what the conservation community should be all about. So what does this look like in practice? I work with both the World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy a lot, and they're really, one of the things that has shifted in recent years is the fact that they're really embracing corporate partnerships. So the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing partnership with Dow Chemical Company. The World Wildlife Fund works with the Coca-Cola Company, and I've worked on some of the projects with Coca-Cola. For example, we have a project in Iowa we're looking at where a lot of the corn syrup that goes into Coca-Cola products is sourced from certain wet mills in Iowa. And Coke is interested in trying to green their supply chain and thinking about if they could more sustainably produce that corn syrup and what would that look like. So those are just some examples of what these conservation private sector partnerships might look like. But these have not been without controversy. So you can imagine there's people on all sides of the spectrum who think this is a great way to go and others who believe this is the wrong direction for conservation. I'd love your thoughts at the end. We have some time for discussion. Another big initiative that we've been involved with is, again, a really interesting alignment between private sector and public sector groups and thinking about putting economic value on nature through the benefits it gives to people and communities. And that's through this concept of water funds. So water funds are a downstream city, and this has really taken off in Latin America, especially across the Andes region, where you have a community located usually at the base of a large mountainous watershed. And that community or a big bottling company that's at the base of that watershed relies on that watershed to provide clean water for their residents or for their business. And so instead of installing a new treatment facility at their plant or in their municipality, they pay the same amount of money into a fund, and then that fund is allocated upstream in the watershed to do things like fence cattle so they don't go and wade in streams, giving stipends or buying up chickens so that people are raising chickens instead of beef, protecting and revegetating hill slopes that have been eroded. So taking those investments and investing them in nature, investing them in watershed protection as a way to secure the water supply for that city. So it can sort of a win-win in that we're protecting a valuable service, source water for people, but we're also investing in nature. We have a water fund in Minnesota. So if the Twin Cities get their water supply from the Mississippi River, and this was a project, a collaboration between Ecolab and the Nature Conservancy chapter here in Minnesota to create a similar fund. And these dollars are now being spent in the headwaters region of the Mississippi River Basin to try and protect the water quality of the Mississippi for downstream users. And we've done some work with TNC to help them figure out how to make the best return on that investment that they have. Where should they be spending those dollars? So that's a quick overview of kind of where the conservation community has come from, where we are now, and what that looks like in practice. So that these kinds of partnerships that the Nature Conservancy and WWF are engaging in now are very different than the buying up tracts of land approach that they took in the past. All right, and so then the last thing I wanted to share with you is about some of our work in Minnesota and how we're taking some of these concepts of nature's value to people and putting them in practice here. Sorry, my slides are a little formatting off, but the main question here is, are we making smart investments in clean water? So this is a big question for the state of Minnesota. Clean water is a really important resource in our state. Like every state, we have limited amount of money that we can spend on protecting and conserving clean water. And so we have to be very strategic in how we use those resources. We also have a couple of interesting opportunities in the state right now. The Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment that, if you were here, was it 9 years ago that we passed this? In the state of Minnesota, we raised our sales taxes for arts and the environment. Clean water receives the largest proportion of funds under the Legacy Amendment. So it's about, ranges depending on sales tax each year, but $100 to $200 million a year go towards clean water. And those decisions are made by a group called the Clean Water Council, and they're a group of legislative and citizen members who decide how that money, how your taxpayer dollars, should be spent on protecting clean water in the state. So we've been working with the Clean Water Fund and the Clean Water Council to try and understand, are they getting a good return on their investment? How far can we move the needle with those existing resources we have? And how do we communicate these values or these benefits back to the public? Probably many of you have seen a map, something like this, that just, did you have a question? Oh, okay. That shows just how many of our waters are impaired. So if the word impairment here refers to it doesn't meet standards under the Clean Drinking Water Act, which means it's not boatable, swimmable, or fishable under some standard. So about 40% of our waters are impaired across the state. That's a lot of problems to try and solve with $100 million, right? So we simply do not have the resources to clean up all the water in the state. So we have to make some difficult decisions about what we can do with the limited resources we have. And a lot of this now comes back to economics. So how do we understand the benefits and the costs of making different investments in trying to protect clean water? So we have lots of choices of lakes and rivers to invest in. Which of those, how much is it going to cost to do a project in a particular place, and what are the benefits that we're going to get from that? And how do we use this framework to help us inform the best ways that we can spend our taxpayer dollars? But in order to answer that question, we have to answer a much more challenging question, which is, what is clean water actually worth? And if we go back to the very beginning, we know that we don't actually know from markets what clean water is worth. So we have to figure out other ways to understand its value. Now, when I think about what clean water is worth, I think about a whole bunch of different things. So clean water isn't one single thing. It's many different things to many different users. So clean water is your property values. Clean water is your health when you drink the water that comes out of your tap. It's how safe the fish are to eat. It's how aesthetically pleasing it is to walk or swim in a river. And it extends to not just what's within our borders as a headwater state, but what we export in terms of water quality problems downstream, whether it's to Lake Winnipeg or to the Gulf of Mexico. So these are many different dimensions of clean water, many different users or beneficiaries, and many different drivers. So sometimes this is a nitrogen problem, sometimes it's a phosphorus problem, maybe it's emerging contaminants, it might be sediment, so it could be a whole bunch of different things. So as I mentioned before, we can't figure out what the value of clean water is by going to the store and buying bottled water. So we know what that's worth, right? It's a couple dollars for a bottle of water, a jug of water. A gallon of water is about 33 cents. It's incredibly cheap to buy water. But those services that clean water provides are not what we're buying in the store. We don't buy units of lake recreation, right? So that raises one of these sort of fundamental paradoxes in the field of economics, and it's called the diamond water paradox. So it goes like this. So water is essential for life. I think no one would argue with that. We literally couldn't live without it. Diamonds are not essential for life. I think most of us would agree with that. And yet they're incredibly valuable. So how do we have this thing that's essential to life, we couldn't live without it, and it's very cheap, and something that's not essential for life, but incredibly expensive? So that's the diamond water paradox. So what explains the diamond water paradox? Many of you are probably thinking about this already, but scarcity is a big part of this, right? So if you think about the value of water, if you're standing out in the middle of the desert and you're incredibly thirsty and someone offers you a glass of water, you would give up pretty much anything, I think, at that point to have that glass of water. That would be incredibly valuable to you because it's very scarce. If someone offered you and said, what would you be willing to pay for the same glass of water standing on the edge of Lake Superior, you might just be like, just dump it out because you're surrounded by water. It's not that valuable to you. So scarcity is a big driver of value, and it's a big part of this explaining this diamond water paradox. The other dimension of this is, what do we get? What's our utility? This is sort of economic speak for how does this translate into well-being when you have a change in a unit of diamonds or you have a change in a unit of water. So we once had a situation in the US where we had rivers that were so polluted they were literally catching on fire. Now that was a very bad thing. And the utility, the well-being changes associated with cleaning up a river that's catching on fire and making it a river that no longer catches on fire, there's a huge well-being gain from that investment in resources, right? Everybody's a lot better off if we don't have a really serious public health hazard like that. The other picture is the Cannon River, which I live in Northfield, so this is my hometown river. And it's impaired because of sediment, which means it's turbid or it's not that clear. So what's the utility that I get from cleaning up the Cannon River, or that all of us get from cleaning up the Cannon River? And let's say it's going to cost X million dollars. Are we going to derive that many $1 million in benefit? It's not a public health concern like a river that's catching on fire, but it could increase recreation, it might increase the aesthetic value, but how do we really understand the utility associated with these changes, these kind of what we call second-order environmental problems, and then decide among a bunch of those which are the best investments? So that brings up this other question of how do we know if something actually has value? And it's not just about dollars. So the way that we figure this out is because we don't know internally how every person is feeling in their little well-being meters, we have to look at how people behave and the way that they express values through trade-offs. So when you go to the store, and you decide you're going to buy a latte in the morning and you pay $4 for it, you're expressing the value that you place on that because you're willing to trade off $4 for that latte, so it must be worth at least that much to you. And that's an expression of the value. You traded off something that you could have used to buy other things for that latte. So that's one way that economists figure out what stuff is worth, is through markets and the trade-offs that people make in the way that they spend dollars. And we're expressing our values through markets and in all day long in everything that we do. What we pay for education, what we pay for the products that we consume. So we're always, as consumers, expressing our value in a market in that way, and it's pretty clear-cut, that trade-off. This gets a little trickier when there isn't a market. So we have to use other approaches. So for example, if you really care about your kid being involved in sports, you might trade off the time you spend in the car driving them around to practice. That's value, right? You're trading off your time and your gas mileage to provide that benefit to your family. And that's not a market that we're talking about now, but it's still a reflection of your value because you're making a trade-off to get more soccer and you're giving up time, right? So it's this, that's what economists are trying to figure out when we figure out what is something worth. We're looking at the trade-offs that people make with respect to that thing out in the world. So quick Econ 101 lesson. So what we just talked about is that sort of market valuation. That's when you actually pay for something in the store. That's the latte. So there might be a market price that you can pay for something. And we value water a little bit through this because we look at how much people have to pay when their well is contaminated. So that's a market. If you have nitrate, elevated nitrate in your well, and you no longer feel safe drinking it, and you have to buy bottled water or dig a new well or install a point of use system in your house, then you're paying into a market. You're saying, well, I care at least that $300 a year or $10,000 to dig a new well. That's the value that I place on not having nitrate in my drinking water. But when there's not a market, especially things like recreation, we have to look at some of these other approaches to try and figure out what water is worth. So one of them is this process of stated preference, which is basically just we ask you what you care about something. So here's an example of what this looks like. This is an actual survey that a colleague of mine at University of Wisconsin uses to try and understand the value people place on different lakes. So if you think about maybe this upcoming weekend, and you're going to take a trip to a lake, and you have your choice of Lake 1 or Lake 2. And Lake 1 is sort of brownish-greenish in color. You can see 1 to 2 feet deep. It has a few rough fish, a few game fish. It has a faint odor, and it's 30 minutes away. So that's one option, right? Lake 2 is blue-brown in color. You can see 2 to 5 feet deep. Has a few more fish. It also has a faint odor. And it's 90 minutes away. So we give people these choices and ask them to think about, put themselves in that situation, and choose which lake they would go to, Lake 1 or Lake 2. So just quick show of hands. How many people would go to Lake 1? Lake 2? All right. You have revealed your preference. You've stated your preference, for clean water and the fact that you're willing to spend that extra time in the car to get that extra unit of clarity. Okay, so that's what we call either contingent valuation, is when you might get a survey in the mail and it says, how much would you be willing to pay in extra taxes every year to have cleaner water in Minnesota? And you might say, I'm willing to pay $100 a year extra in taxes to have cleaner water. And that would be a stated preference way. And that's one way that we try and figure out, like, okay, how much do Minnesotans, how much are they really willing to trade off to get more of this water good? So that stated preference, or that choice modeling, is just that lake choice experiment that I just showed. So then I'm just going to share a little bit about this other approach, which is revealed preference. And this is basically where we don't ask you what you care about clean water. We just spy on you to try and figure out how your behavior reveals the choices and the values you place on clean water. So I was really interested in this question about what are clean lakes worth. We talk about the value of water, and we talk about how much we care about lakes in Minnesota. But I wanted to know, in people's behavior about the lakes that they visit, how much are they actually revealing that preference for cleaner water? And by that, I want to know, do people visit clear lakes more often than less clear lakes? And do they travel further to visit those lakes? And are they revealing in that behavior the fact that they care about water clarity? So to do this, traditionally, you would use a survey. And they actually did this in Iowa. We don't have a survey in Minnesota that asks people this question. What lakes did you go to? How far did you travel to get there? Which is kind of crazy, but surveys are very expensive. So we used another approach. We used geotagged social media. In this case, we used photos uploaded to the photo sharing website Flickr. Has anyone here used Flickr? Okay, a few. The numbers are going down every time I give this presentation, but we're looking in some other platforms now. So if you took a photo and you uploaded it to Flickr and it was geolocated, so that means we know where that photo was taken, we had a data point that said this person was at that lake at this time. We don't know anything. I didn't look at the photos, I promise. I just knew that there was somebody who was at that lake at a certain point in time. The other piece of information that Flickr gave us was the home location of those photo takers. So I was able to make some really cool maps, like this one, that shows people's hometowns, which are the red circles, and then the routes that they took to visit all the different lakes that they had photographed that showed up in their Flickr photo profile. So you can see, someone from Denver, they went to Minneapolis, and then they went up to the Boundary Waters, and they went to Lake 1, and then Lake 2, and then Lake 3 and 4. So it was a really interesting data set to ask those. So now all of a sudden I have these two pieces of information that I'm really interested in. So I want to know, did those people go to clear lakes more often, and did they travel further to get there? And the answer is yes to both of those questions. And what we found is that as clarity increases, people are willing to spend about an extra hour in the car for a 1 meter increase in clarity. So you can kind of back out that, if you consider gas and time, what's the economic value of that? But I don't think the number is really the important thing here. I think it's just this evidence that we have, which I think is very intuitive for all of us. And you confirmed this when you responded to that choice experiment. But that people do, through their behavior, reveal their preference for clean water. So we do make those decisions, whether we're aware of it or not. We're trading off our time seeking those higher quality recreational experiences. We've used this and a whole bunch of other approaches to produce reports on a lot of different things. So one of the things we did a couple of years ago for the legislature was an evaluation of the return on investment in public land acquisition in the state. So we went back in time, we looked at all the investments DNR had made in public lands, and then we built a model of Minnesota without those investments. So we tried to imagine what the state might look like now if we hadn't made those investments in public lands. And then we looked at the return on services, the ecosystem services provided by those two different versions of Minnesota, and that's where we came up with this number. For every dollar that you invest in public land, you're getting a return in public goods, a return on that investment between a 1-to-1 to a 1-to-6 return. We recently did another analysis looking at the benefits of conservation reserve program lands in agricultural areas. So this is federal payments that landowners receive to take their land out of production and put it into perennial cover. And in this case, we did a lot of modeling of the flood benefits of taking lands out of production, and estimated, again, sort of a similar return on investment in terms of the tax dollars that go towards conservation reserve payments and the public benefits that come back to society. Water quality, air quality, flood protection, biodiversity, carbon storage. I mentioned I've done some work on groundwater contamination and the costs associated with contaminated water, especially for nitrates. So this was some work that we published a couple of years ago, and we recently just updated and did it statewide. So now we understand the costs both to private well owners and also to public water suppliers. How much are individual households and communities having to pay because of nitrate contamination in their water? So a lot of this work comes down to these questions then. If we start to know the values on some of these things, then we can start to we actually have to make some value judgments then about, among those many kinds of water values, what are the most important investments we should be making as a state? So should we be investing all our resources in protecting drinking water, especially groundwater contamination? if that's the plan, if that's the goal, then we would invest in the red watersheds in that far map. Those are the places where you're going to get the highest return on investment in improving people's drinking water from groundwater contamination. If we think about where you get the best return on investment in terms of recreational use, you might get a different investment portfolio. And then if you're thinking about the impacts of reducing Gulf hypoxia down in the Gulf of Mexico, we basically know where to make those investments to reduce nutrients, but the benefit, the people who are really affected aren't even in Minnesota. Right? They're downstream in the Gulf of Mexico. So whose water, whose values are we going to prioritize in how we make decisions about big public dollars like we have on the table now in Minnesota? Depends on values. Okay, so I just want to close by talking about 3 things that our program is working at the Institute that might be of interest here. One is really thinking carefully about the environmental justice and equity dimensions of water. So this idea of whose values, so not just looking at where we're going to see nitrate contamination of drinking water supplies, but how much of that nitrate contamination falls on rural communities where the cost of building a new treatment facility may have to be divided among only 700 households. And that's a huge per household cost. In the Twin Cities, if you have to install a treatment facility, we might see a couple dollars of increase in our water bills. In a rural area, that could be hundreds of dollars per household per year. And then what's the, who has access to clean water and how does that vary by income status, by race, by cultural association, by tribal lands. So trying to understand and unpack sort of all the different human dimensions of how we relate to water and how that relates to governance and institutions and the sort of activism that we have around water. The second thread of work that's new for us is translating some of these values and valuation processes into urban environments. So we're working right now on a new initiative thinking about, the value of nature in the city. So in addition to some of the ecosystem services that are really specific to agricultural and forested landscapes like we've been talking about, in the city we're thinking about cultural value, urban agriculture, urban warming, so urban heat island effect. We've done some really interesting work on mental health recently, so trying to understand the evidence that nature actually provides these really important mood and cognitive benefits in the city, and emerging work in psychology has really helped to elevate and communicate those values. So how much of that is ready to translate into planning by parks boards or by landscape architects or by designers and planners. And then we just recently completed an analysis where we used Twitter to understand where people go and visit different parks in the Twin Cities area and what amenities drive visitation. So that's another way of translating some of that social media research into decisions about parks and green spaces in urban areas. And then third is really thinking about what we're doing as an academic institution in terms of being responsive to the communities that we want to engage in and the impact that we want to have in the world. And this is something that I think that the Institute on the Environment is really passionate about. I was excited to hear about some of the same inroads that UMR is making in terms of integrating better with the community. And I think it matters not only for the work that we're doing, but it really matters for addressing these complex social ecological problems. So if we really want to think about that human-nature interface, we can't just be doing economics as usual and ecology as usual. We have to bring the people and the decision makers into that and break down some of those academic silos. So we're doing some experiments to sort of figure out how to reform some of the incentive structures that we have right now that prevent that collaboration across disciplines. And I really think it comes back to the users and the communities that we serve and bringing their questions and their needs and their insights into the academic work that we're doing so that we're also training students to sit comfortably at that space in between disciplines. So in summary, you could, this is me and my son up in the North Shore. And I think we're still discovering nature's value. So I presented a bunch of examples of how we're starting to understand really the evidence base for the way that nature contributes to our well-being, but we still have a lot more to uncover. I also think it's important to recognize that the value we place on nature isn't some other value out there that economists are going to figure out. It's actually us. So we determine the value that we place on nature. And when you fill out a survey or when you drive further to visit a lake, you're actually expressing that value. So we all have a place in terms of deciding what values we want to elevate and communicate as consumers, as recreationists, as citizens. And to feel like the choices that we make are actually really important in determining the value that we have and what we demand from our environment. What kind of future Minnesota do we want to live in? And that value, determining what that value that we place on that is really up to us. And the last thing is that I believe we can use some of this information about nature's value to make better decisions now. And we are doing that with groups like the Clean Water Council, working with the LCCMR, so the group that funds acquisitions and easements in the state, and Department of Health, and a bunch of other actors. So that's what I have to share today. I'm happy to take questions from the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You engendered an idea, a thought in my mind. That should be a laudable result of what you said. Recently, the Post-Bulletin had an article about the runoff of salt from roads. Mm-hmm. Question, is it irreversible to our lakes, or is it irreversible to our streams and rivers or not? And what are the implications of continued use of salt products in our roads versus our water?
It's a great question. I'll start by saying I'm not an expert in the impacts of salt on aquatic ecosystems. So what I know is probably about what's in that article, which is that we know that salinity has been increasing in our lakes and rivers over time, and we know that that's correlated with the use of road salt. The long-term impacts of that, I think we still don't fully understand what that'll do to food chains and what that does to nutrient cycling and the health impacts for organisms, aquatic organisms that live in those areas. So there's a lot of emerging work, I think, on the science side of things, but that has drawn attention, and now there's real changes that are being made, I think, as a result. So it's a good example of being responsive to, I think, a growing concern. I believe it's irreversible. I mean, salt, this is again outside of my expertise, but I do have a background in biogeochemistry. Salt is pretty labile. It's pretty mobile, right? So it shouldn't collect in the environment if it's dissolved. I guess my sense is that it's something that systems can recover from.
It seems like we're making a move away from kind of a John Muir spiritual view of nature to a more economic view. And perhaps that's because we need to pose an argument in terms that the people who have kind of say or sway over things understand and maybe can agree or disagree with. But do you feel like maybe this is all for naught? And the reason I ask is because when I look at the distribution of the vote over this last election, the largest swaths of natural areas that I think we're talking about were ones that went to a party that really just does not believe what you say at all. And I wonder if you feel like you're kind of maybe at making a major move in your conversation with not having any end in sight. And perhaps the Polytech mine up in northern Minnesota that I'm surprised that really you didn't mention is a battleground here that will really test your ability to make that case for the value of nature versus its utility.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So I think there's a couple parts there. So one is the question of whether or not taking this more economic or utilitarian view of nature in some way sort of supplants that more intrinsic value or ethical view of of nature, nature for nature's sake, let's just say that's a way of capturing it. I tend to believe that they're not mutually exclusive, that there's no reason why that nature for nature's sake or the spiritual or intrinsic value of nature, the legacy of nature, shouldn't continue to be a really important set of values and something that I reinforce when we talk to people. So in addition to that, it's also useful to recognize that nature provides all these benefits to people and communities. And if we start to acknowledge that the role that nature plays in, flood mitigation of a town or in securing fresh water for a community, what we have seen in the work we've done at the Natural Capital Project is that it can broaden those constituencies beyond just the people who believed in nature for nature's sake or the traditional sort of conservation groups. So we have, I think, several examples where elevating those values have brought new people to the table, new incentives, new financial mechanisms for conservation that weren't there before. I'm not saying that it's always a win, this is not a panacea and it's not the solution to all of our conservation problems, but I think it's part of the solution. And I think, I'm pretty optimistic about, because of a lot of the work that we've done and especially being, in a state like Minnesota that places such a high value on our sense of place, and so much of our sense of place is tied to water and tied to nature. I was at a meeting of this group called the Minnesota Sustainable Growth Coalition, which is a coalition of about 30 of the biggest companies that work in the Twin Cities and greater Minnesota area. Best Buys, Cargill's, GM, Health Partners, Anderson Windows, all those groups. And we sat around a table and we're talking about water. And there were many different dimensions of water that came up in that meeting, but it was everything from companies where water was a material part of their supply chain, so they're Hormel, and they actually need a lot of water for that food production, food manufacturing, and processing, to groups that felt like water was essential for the attraction and retention of talent. So they felt, especially in bringing people, they need to recruit and retain talent, and they felt like being able to say, Minnesota's a great place to live. We have clean lakes and clean rivers. We have all these recreational amenities. That was a really important part of their business proposition, and so that motivates them to be at the table in these kinds of conversations. So do we have big problems? Yes. But are we making progress in some dimensions? Yes. I didn't talk about polymet. We are working on mining issues in northern Minnesota. So that's another, we're working with a bunch of different groups to try and understand the full costs of potential scenarios around mining. And so that means everything from air pollution impacts to water quality impacts, and how do you really understand under a bunch of different scenarios going far out into the future about how those mines are operated and their long-term legacy in that area, what might the consequences be. So we don't have the results of that yet, but it's something we're working on. Yeah.
Yes, I've got a question. You mentioned, underground water being polluted or being contaminated. Mm-hmm. How do you protect underground water not to be contaminated?
How do you protect groundwater?
Yeah. How do you do that?
Yeah.
And if it is contaminated, as you mentioned, then what will you do to clean it up?
Yeah. So two really good questions. So we can actually do a lot to prevent groundwater from being contaminated. One is to just reduce the amount of contaminants that we're using. So that's one approach. So that includes both industrial contaminants and the contaminants we apply to agriculture, which is pretty much the predominant source of nitrate that ends up into our groundwaters from agriculture in the state. But nitrate that's applied to fields doesn't necessarily have to end up in the groundwater if it's managed appropriately. So there's lots of different technologies that you can use to try and prevent that nitrogen from ending up recharging into groundwater. This is a much bigger issue in certain parts of the state than others. So if you're in this area, in the karst topography, there's lots of porousness in these rocks here, and when you put something on the surface, it can readily drain down into those groundwater aquifers. And the central sands part of Minnesota, that's also another big issue. If you pour chemicals through sand, they end up in your groundwater. There's other places in the state that have really thick layers of glacial drift and deep bedrock aquifers, and those are pretty safe from contamination. So you can not put the contaminants on the surface, and you can better manage nutrients and contaminants on field and in preventing them from getting into groundwater. Once they're in groundwater, they're really hard to deal with. So prevention, this is where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we need to work on trying to protect our groundwater resources so they're there in the future. And I think that that's a good return on investment.
Yeah, first it's amazing how diverse the benefits of nature can be, but then also how diverse the attitudes of people can be to come to a value. So I applaud your taking on something so very complicated. It's important though. But your point about everybody has different values. And I'm seeing how having an emotional connection to something in nature can change people's values so much. But to make that emotional connection, it's like you have to have places that people can go and actually experience it. Photographs, they're pretty shallow. Getting a person really there, you know, taking your son up to the North Shore hiking and along that makes a big difference. You know, so that's one of the things I'm concerned with, is trying to get, because I grew up on the edge of town and I go out in nature all the time, and I see kids nowadays, parents of kids too, who just, I can't let my kid go out and do that. You know, just to mess around in nature, and that's very important. So I don't know, that's another sort of underlying all those different values, or not all of the values, but many of the values. It's it makes it a harder thing to evaluate, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know from research that people's values are very malleable, right? They change over time. They're very dynamic. They're not static. We even know that people's values for clean water, for example, vary depending on what their baseline is, like what their exposure is around them. So if you ask someone in Iowa what they would consider swimmable level of lake clarity, they'll be like, well, you know, if like you can see your toes when you stand in it. And if you ask someone in northern Minnesota, and there's surveys that show this, they're like, well, I would need to see at least like 4 or 5 feet of clarity before I would swim in anything. So based on, you know, what you're used to, or what you know, kind of what value you place on that, what you're exposed to, that shapes our values. And so one concern in the conservation community is this idea of sort of shifting baselines. So if we all accept a lower level of environmental quality as normal, then we no longer have this demand for this higher level of quality. And that's one of the main reasons that we're working more in the urban area, because that's where most of the world's population lives, and that's where most of the world's population with contact with nature will be now, and will, you know, is now and will be in the future. So I totally agree for that need to establish that human-nature connection through education and experience.
Here's a practical application. Our farmers, many resent having to stay away from riverbanks that go through their property. Many farmers agree to do that, and they welcome that opportunity in a sense. How do we handle that particular issue here in Minnesota?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the buffer rule has turned out to be an incredibly controversial piece of policy. I was just talking to a farmer a couple weeks ago who is a corn and soybean farmer in southern Minnesota. He's always had buffers on his land. No one ever paid him to do that. He just felt like it was the right thing to do. But he also rents some land, and on the rental land, the landowner has never let him put buffers in his fields. So he says, no, I need you to plow all the way to the edge of the creek. So there's all kinds of levers and incentives and things that cause the decisions that farmers make. I believe that farmers want clean water, just like we all do. Farmers drink the water that's in the wells underneath their houses. They care about pollution. So I know from we're working with the governor's water office right now on a couple of new initiatives, and I know one of the things that Dayton has reflected on after that buffer rule is realizing that a very top-down command and control approach to putting in, incentivizing transformation in our agricultural landscapes is maybe not the approach to take. So he's actually going to start now investing more in kind of bottom-up, community-based, volunteer, local action approaches. There'll be a series of town halls this year going around the state trying to crowdsource ideas for clean water because he wants to reach this 25 by 25 goal. So yes, so I think this is complicated because there's private property rights. There's not a very good incentive system. We incentivize the production of maximizing the agricultural commodities you produce on your field. We don't pay people to protect clean water downstream. We don't pay them for pollinator habitat. We don't incentivize them to provide those public goods. And so if we want those things, then maybe we should pay for them. Or, I mean, that's one perspective. The other is, if you're causing environmental harm to people downstream, maybe you should pay for that harm. So it's, do you pay the polluter, or does the polluter pay? But we need carrots or sticks to make changes, right? So it's, if you want less of something, you should tax it. If you want more of it, you should incentivize it. And those sort of basic rules of economics play into a lot of the environmental decision making that we make. It's complicated, though, because these are people. And, decision making is never as clear cut as you might think it is. Yeah.
But there's also like lawn chemicals people put on. They took a survey in the cities, I think.
Yes, yes.
But I mean, how do you get people to say, I don't need this much green lawn that, I have neighbors I have one neighbor that mows his lawn like 5 days and stuff, five times a week. And he goes out and mows and they fertilize and they put all the stuff on it, water the streets. How do you incentivize people to not do that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great behavioral question, right? Of what motivates people's behavior and how do people respond to things. And so in that case, it's not simply like a tax, probably, and it's not like an incentive. So in terms of managing private green space, it's a lot about communities and pressure from neighbors and creating a new narrative about like what is an acceptable lawn to have, what does a pretty lawn look like. Yeah, it can. Yeah, exactly. So those norms, I think, are really challenging to. Yeah. I agree.
Comment is, I'm trying to do the same thing. It's a competition.
Yeah.
Everybody wants this golf course. So I went out and planted some stuff in the backyard, and it's natural.
Yeah. My neighbors come over.
I'm not sure they would. I'm not sure the neighbor would appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's a competition.
I know.
Not everybody.
Things that I'm losing it because the competition.
Well, I'm in. I know it's good money.
And you're doing good things for the world. Yeah, exactly.
But you don't think about what it is.
Well, my neighbor does. He said something about, I grew up with well, it doesn't stay in the lawn. It doesn't soak in here. We have so much rock. And I said, where do you think it goes? And he said, I never thought about it.
Does anybody else have any other questions? No. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, don't pick yourself. Mary Lynn's last. Did you draw yourself? Nope. And I hope I can say this name right, and I'm sorry if I don't. Raya? R-A-I-A? Hi. You just want a t-shirt? Do you want a medium or a large? You can choose. Right over here. Take whichever one you want. Next week we're going to have some students that went on a trip to Germany in over the semester break, and it was part of their study away program with one of our professors here, James Ford. There's a couple of students from the Twin Cities campus and Rochester, and it's going to be a pretty interesting presentation, and there's the flyers in the back. Germany, Turkey, and the U.S. and the whole idea of immigration and how we treat refugees and how the countries are different in their beliefs and such. So if you're interested in that, please come back next week. The students have really put a lot of work into this. In May, we start our spring into summer, so it's going to kind of lighter topics are coming. And one of the presentations I really want to highlight, I've got John Creasel and Kevin Lund, who are, you might know those names from Rochester, right, if you're from here. So Kevin Lund obviously is a judge, and John Creasel owns the antique shop. They're both actually historians in Rochester, and they're going to talk about historical preservation of the city. So really an interesting topic, and they'll be here on May 23rd. So I'm just kind of putting that one out there now because I'd really love to have a great showing for them. It's I think it's going to be really interesting, and I think it's something that we all, with our city so rapidly changing over the next couple of years, the whole idea of historical preservation is kind of a big deal, I think. So anyway, that'll be toward the end of May, and then we move outside in a few weeks. So thanks for everybody.